2. The role of leadership in organizational culture. Creating culture, the foundational role of leaders. In Edgar Schein's examination of organizational culture, one of the pivotal concepts he discusses is how leaders are integral to the formation and evolution of culture within organizations. This process, rooted in the beliefs and values of the organization's founders, establishes the foundational norms and rules that ultimately shape the organization's cultural landscape. The influence of founders. Founders of an organization play a disproportionately large role in culture creation because their own beliefs and values are often deeply embedded in the organization's operational and strategic frameworks. This embedding process involves several key actions and decisions. Vision setting. Founders articulate a vision that often encompasses broad, idealistic goals for the organization. This vision provides a rallying point for employees and sets the tone for the organizational culture. Tone at the top. The behaviors and attitudes of founders set a precedent for types of behaviors that are valued within the organization. This includes their approach to business ethics, their communication style, and their interactions with employees and other stakeholders. Decision-making norms. Founders establish norms around decision-making that can either empower individuals and promote autonomy or centralize authority and enforce hierarchy, depending on their personal management styles. Response to crisis. How founders handle crisis can solidify certain cultural elements. For instance, a leader's calmness and clarity in crisis can instill a culture of resilience and transparency. Mechanisms of culture formation. Schein highlights several mechanisms through which leaders create and manage culture. Selection. Leaders influence culture through whom they hire, selecting employees whose values align with those of the organization ensures that the foundational culture is reinforced rather than diluted. Rewards and recognition. What leaders recognize and reward shapes the culture significantly. For example, if innovation is frequently rewarded, a culture of creativity and risk-taking is likely to develop. Stories and symbols. Founders often create and propagate stories or symbols that become a part of the organization's lore. These stories and symbols, which may highlight key moments or decisions, serve as powerful tools for communicating cultural norms. Role modeling. Leaders are watched closely and often emulated by employees. Their daily behavior functions as a live case study for how to act within the organization. Evolution of culture. While the initial culture stems largely from the founders, it evolves as the organization grows. New leaders, external events, and internal developments all contribute to the dynamic nature of culture. Leaders must therefore be mindful of how it's evolving and take active steps to shape it deliberately, rather than letting it develop haphazardly. Challenges in cultural stewardship. Leaders face significant challenges in managing organizational culture. Consistency vs. adaptation. Balancing the need to maintain a consistent culture with the need to adapt to changing external conditions is a critical challenge. Scaling culture as organizations grow. What works in a small, founder-led team may not hold in a large, diverse workforce. Leaders must find ways to scale the culture effectively while keeping its core values intact. Subcultures. In larger organizations, subcultures can develop that may either enrich or conflict with the overall culture. Leaders need to understand these dynamics and address potential conflicts. In summary, the process of creating and managing organizational culture is complex and requires continuous, deliberate effort from leaders. Schein's insights into the mechanisms of culture formation, provide a valuable framework for leaders to understand their pivotal role in this process, ensuring that the culture they foster supports the organization's objectives and values. B. Changing culture. Changing culture, a strategic imperative for leaders. In Edgar Schein's influential work on organizational culture, he emphasizes that leaders are not only creators, but also custodians and sometimes transformers of organizational culture. Changing an organization's culture is one of the most challenging leadership responsibilities, primarily because it involves altering the foundational assumptions and values that dictate how members of the organization behave, make decisions, and interpret their environment. Understanding the existing culture before any effective change can be initiated. Leaders must have a thorough understanding of the existing culture at all three levels Schein identifies. Artifacts. This is the most visible layer of the culture, including everything from office layout and dress code to workflows and communications. While easy to observe, artifacts alone can be misleading without deeper context. Espoused values. These are the stated values and norms of the organization, often articulated in mission statements and corporate value declarations. Understanding whether these espoused values are in alignment with what is actually practiced is crucial for pinpointing cultural discrepancies. Basic underlying assumptions. These are the core beliefs and unconscious assumptions that are often taken for granted within an organization. They are the hardest to change because they are deeply embedded and invisible. Yet, they are the most powerful drivers of an organization's culture because they influence how members perceive, think, and feel. Steps for changing culture. Changing organizational culture is a deliberate and strategic process that involves several key steps. Diagnosis and awareness. The first step is a comprehensive diagnosis of the current culture, identifying the aspects that leaders want to change, and understanding the underlying assumptions that may need to be addressed. Creating a vision for change. Leaders must create and communicate a compelling vision for what the changed culture should look like. This vision should align with the strategic goals of the organization and address any current cultural aspects that are problematic. Role modeling by leadership. Leaders must themselves embody the changes they wish to see in the organization. This involves behaving in ways that reflect the new cultural norms and demonstrating a commitment to the values they wish to instill. Mobilizing commitment. Changing culture requires the buy-in and commitment of the organization's members. Leaders should engage with employees at all levels to involve them in the change process, using techniques such as workshops, training sessions, and open discussions to foster alignment. Aligning systems and structures. The organizational systems, structures, and processes must be realigned to support the new culture. This might involve changing reward systems, reviewing recruitment practices, and modifying decision-making processes to reinforce the new cultural norms. Consistent reinforcement. Culture change is not a one-time event, but a continuous process that needs constant reinforcement. This includes regular communication of success stories that highlight the benefits of the new culture, as well as ongoing training and development. Challenges in changing culture. Resistance to change. Resistance from employees can be a major barrier. This is often due to fear of the unknown, attachment to old ways, or skepticism about the benefits of change. Deeply embedded assumptions. Changing the basic underlying assumptions is challenging because they are not only hard to detect, but also deeply ingrained in the organization's psyche. Time and persistence. Cultural change is a long-term process that requires persistence and patience. It cannot be rushed and often takes longer than leaders anticipate. In conclusion, Changing an organization's culture, as per Schein's framework, requires a deep understanding of its current norms and values, a clear vision for the future, and strategic steps to implement change. Leaders play a crucial role in guiding this process and must be proactive, committed, and consistent in their efforts to shape and direct the culture towards desired outcomes. T. Cultural change navigating complexity and resistance. Edgar Schein's insights into organizational culture stress the immense challenge of cultural change within organizations. This process involves not just superficial adjustments to policies or practices, but a fundamental shift in the underlying values, assumptions, and behaviors that define the organization. Effective cultural change requires strategic and sensitive intervention from leadership, aimed at both discarding outdated values and assumptions, and adopting new ones that better align with the organization's evolving goals and environment. Steps for effective cultural change. 1. Identifying the need for change. The first step in cultural change is recognizing that some aspects of the current culture are no longer aligned with the organization's needs. This misalignment could be due to various factors, including shifts in the external market, internal growth challenges, technological advancements, or a change in strategic direction. Leadership must assess and articulate the specific cultural elements that are problematic and the new cultural aspects that need to be fostered. 2. Defining clear objectives and values. Leaders must clearly define the new values and behavioral norms they wish to instill. This involves developing a detailed vision of the desired culture, often articulated through new mission statements, value propositions, and behavioral guidelines. These new cultural objectives should be practical, measurable, and directly tied to the organization's strategic goals.
Hello, I'm Tim Coupler with CultureUniversity.com. I'm very pleased today to be interviewing Edgar Schein, Professor Emeritus of MIT Sloan School of Management and leading thought leader in the field of culture. Welcome, Edgar.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Okay, well, you've been exploring the subject of culture for over 50 years. Why culture? What's attracted you to this subject?
Well, I think it all started with consulting.
Okay.
Once you get out into a company and discover that companies differ, my early experience was on the one hand in the U.S. with Digital Equipment Corporation, and one of the early leaders in that business, and very engineering oriented. And about the same time, I was working with Ciba-Geigy in Switzerland,
Okay.
a chemical company, and they're both highly successful and about as different as night and day. So you have to explain the difference.
Okay. Well, for our listeners, what is culture?
Well, to follow up on explaining the difference, I think you really have to go back to what these companies do and how they were founded. Digital was a company founded by an electrical engineer who had a particular value system of how you manage people and how you do things. For example, he insisted on salesmen being salaried, which at that time was unheard of. And so he imposes his values on a company and makes people behave in a certain way because he's the boss, and it works beautifully. So in a few years, people say, well, this must be the right way to do it because it's working, not because he said so, but because it's working. So as people begin to take for granted what's working, that set of things they've learned how to do external business, how to organize themselves, that concept becomes their culture. But after 5, 10, 20 years, they forget that it was all Knut Olson's original idea, that it's now the debt culture. It's the only way we can imagine doing things. So now business conditions change and we really need to do things differently. We don't want to, because we want to do it the way we were successful. So culture in that sense is like personality or character for an individual. Once you've learned to be a certain kind of person, that is you in all aspects of your functioning, and you don't want to be any differently, which is why culture is hard to change.
So is culture important for any organization? Doesn't matter the size, the industry, for-profit, nonprofit. Does it matter to any organization, or should it?
Well, if culture is like personality or character, then it matters in the sense to what extent is the culture adaptive to both the external and internal realities. If it's not adaptive, it matters a lot.
Right.
If it's adaptive, it doesn't matter much. People don't notice it. They just go along their merry way. So culture really only matters when there's a problem, in the same sense that personality only matters when things aren't working right for you. Otherwise, it's just there. It's part of you.
Okay, like personality.
Like personality, exactly.
So how do you define culture?
I then define culture as the sum total of everything an organization has learned in its history in dealing with the external problems, which should be goals, strategy, means, how we do things, and how it organizes itself internally, which is how we're going to relate to each other, what kind of a hierarchy, digital's idea of empowering people, IBM's idea of let's be a real sales marketing organization. These early learnings, if they're successful, become the definition, but it's always something that's been learned. It's not something that just either can be imposed or that's just there.
I know a lot of people use the definition of culture just being how we do things around here. And I know you really encourage people to guard against oversimplifying the subject of culture. Why is that?
Well, because culture operates at many levels, and certainly how we do things around here is the surface level. I like to think of culture to be like the lily pond. On the surface, you've got leaves and flowers and things. They're very visible. A visitor would see them. That's how we do things around here. But the explanation of why we do things in that way forces you to look at the root system, what's feeding it, and the history of the pond, who planted what. If you don't dig down into the reasons for why we do things this way, you've only looked at the culture at a very superficial level, and you haven't really understood it.
Do you see that being commonly done where people are really looking at the surface aspect of culture and not really going deeper?
Well, I think it's where people always start.
Okay.
Because it's the easiest. But the reason for going beyond it is if you think you've got a culture issue or a problem because something isn't working right in the organization. And that something not working right can start out being just a surface phenomenon. Let's say your sales are off and you think it's because your salespeople aren't collaborating with each other enough. And they say, well, that's how we always do things. We have an individual incentive system, and so that's our culture. We compete. And so now you realize that that's the problem. So now you have to say, well, how did we get to this state of being individually competitive? Now you're beginning to dig down underneath the behavior and look at what's going on in the culture. And you may discover that, well, that's how your founder always defined things, that he always wanted maximum individual competition. And he built that into the career system, into the incentive system, into the bonus system. So now it's easy to say, well, let's change that. But you're now going to change a whole bunch of structural things that have supported this behavior, and therefore it's not going to be so easy to change.
Well, what if you have a leader that is really interested in understanding their culture at a deeper level as a foundation to manage change and improvement more effectively? Where do they start? What's the approach you advocate?
Well, I would back up and say if a leader just starts with wanting to change the culture, he already doesn't understand the problem. I think you never start with changing. It's like saying, would you decide one day to change your personality? The first question would be, why? Why would you want to do that? And that's the question I would ask any leader who comes to me and says, I think we need a culture change. I would say, one, what do you mean by culture? And two, why do you think you need a change at all? And if he says, what do you mean? I would say, well, what's your business problem? What isn't working? Why are you change oriented in the first place? Okay. And when that's clearly defined as a business problem, then we can ask the question, well, given the culture, is that going to help you solve the problem or hinder you? And it always ends up being both. There are always parts of the culture that help solve the problem, and other parts of the culture that get in the way. And so then you're finally at the point of saying, well, maybe I need a culture change program. But you got there by thinking about what business problem are you trying to solve.
Okay, that makes sense. I know a lot of people start early in the process with a culture survey. And I know you have some strong feelings about using surveys to define your culture or evaluate it.
Well, you've used three words. You've used culture, engagement, and climate.